Hey everyone, we have made some great progress over the last few episodes on building out the port of Amaranth Bay. Today we'll be filling in this weird parcel of land that sits between the freeway and the bay with a wastewater treatment plant that has a little bit of a twist to it. We'll get to the twist in a bit, but first I wanted to focus on the main facilities for the wastewater treatment portion of the build. To start off, I added a simple road just to outline the available area and make sure that the location is nice and flat, because this kind of detailed build really doesn't work too well on sloped ground. I'm going to take that outline and just fudge it out a little bit into the bay to give us some more real estate to work with, which ended up being a pretty good decision because this thing is going to get fairly cramped. Over here, we've had this rail spur that passes under the freeway, just waiting to be used for something interesting. So I'm going to extend that out alongside the road here, and we're going to come back later on when we get to that twist that I mentioned, and we'll integrate that into the facility. I tried to remember as best I could what the various stages of wastewater treatment are from the last time I built something like this in my Todos Santos series. So I'm going to start with these round pieces, which are called the primary clarifiers, I believe, which basically allow particulate matter to settle out of the water. To the right, you have these rectangular things, which are called aeration basins, I think, which I believe allow for microorganism activity to break down various organic things that remain in the water at this stage. Also, I wanted to switch things up a bit by adding covers to these clarifiers, which you can actually see at the wastewater treatment facility in Duluth, which is in a different location than we're working in. The best kind of dome-like asset that I could find on the workshop that had the right sort of texture was this ball thingy, I guess, that I think is used to store natural gas. And to make it look slightly less like an eyeball, I squished it down with PO and fit it to the top of the clarifier base so that it looks like more of a shallow type of dome. I'm going to take these and paste them over to the other side of the aeration basin as well, and then just shrink them down a little bit. I'm grouping them together with PO and then using the distort function to shrink the entire assembly. And these are going to represent the smaller scale secondary clarifiers, which, as far as I remember, basically do the exact same thing as the primary clarifiers, just after the water has been processed through the aeration basins. At this point, I realized that there was a bit more space than I anticipated, so I adjusted these a little bit and added another aeration basin, which I think looks a little bit more realistic than just having a single, relatively small one in between. I used this clipping network, which basically just cuts a hole through the earth into the void, and they reveal all the very nice detail that's built into these assets. In Duluth, each of the 4 clarifiers seems to have a small building connecting them at the center, and I didn't really have anything that looked too fancy, so I just used this bare warehouse building and squeezed it down into basically a cube shape, and then covered up the miniature doors that resulted with normal-sized doors. To tie everything together, I just used this amazing pipe network to run, presumably, liquid from the clarifiers into this building, which I guess would connect to some sort of underground pipe network or something like that. So now we're going to move backwards slightly in the water treatment process, and we have step 1, which, if I remember correctly, is where large objects are screened out of the water as it enters the facility. I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out what kind of large objects could possibly make their way into the water supply while I focus on building this thing. So I'm using another copy of the aeration basin, and then just adjusting it with PO a little bit to make it look like there are more distinct channels as opposed to these kind of pools. And even with those changes, I thought that it still looked a little bit too similar to the aeration basins, so I thought that I'd try to vary it up by adding some moving water through the channels. So I just used this waterfall prop, rotated 90 degrees with PO, and got rid of this little skirt here, squishing it down a little bit with PO, and then clipped them together and had these nice long channels of water run through here. At the time, I wasn't really sure if it looked particularly good or realistic, but over the course of the build, I kind of warmed up to it. So for now, I'm going to keep it unless you guys riot in the comments and tell me that it looks terrible, in which case I will probably come back and remove it. But that's staying there for now. Next to this is the main building, which I'm sure houses all sorts of water treatment things that I have no idea about. But there does usually seem to be a main building of some sort attached near the screening facilities, so I decided to put that here. I'm using this large building from a modular nuclear power plant pack, as you might expect, I guess, and shrinking them down to a scale that's more appropriate for this build. Just like with the other assets that I've used so far, I wanted to make some additions and adjustments to make everything feel more purpose-made for this environment, mainly adding some doors to replace the mini ones, and a little extension that runs out onto the walkway in the screening facility, which in turn feeds into a path system that snakes through the various buildings in this facility to provide maintenance access or something like that. Don't worry about all the ugly surface painter and all that stuff, because I just went back off camera and got rid of those, but I didn't want to subject you to that kind of boredom. I didn't want to subject myself to it either, but I did. So with the visual bits taken care of, I came back to add some functionality. I had some temporary water treatment blocks at the edge of the map up until this point, which took care of the numbers side of things, but I do think that it's more fun to have our utilities represented somewhere in the city. So we'll be doing that with, of course, a few water treatment blocks here clipped into the various buildings and connected up with pipes so that they actually function. Then in the main building here, we'll have a garbage block as well to represent the solid waste that is removed during the screening process, and that's basically just there to generate the corresponding amount of garbage truck traffic. And for good measure, I also added an office block to represent the job positions here. Over here, we're a bit cramped for space, but I wanted to have a separate administrative building, which I think is going to serve as a nicer introduction for anyone who's entering the facility, as opposed to a literal nuclear power plant building, which is maybe not so attractive. It sticks out quite a bit into the water, so I'm going to extend the land out with some terraforming roads and then detail up the office and the entrance area. The vicinity around the office here is going to serve as the main entrance because this road is eventually going to run along the shoreline under the freeway bridge and then connect up to the normal road system, while the other side of the facility is kind of more of a back entrance that's connected into the rail yard area and the industrial road system. To go along with that layout, I added a visitor and employee parking lot kind of area that is fit to the shape of the kind of triangular shoreline here. And while I was working along there, I figured I'd also add some grass and shrubs to the shore. Although now that I'm looking at it, I think kind of like a rocky shoreline would work better here. So maybe I'll come back later and add that whenever I remember to open my to-do list when I'm playing the game. We'll have this entrance road split into two so that we can have a separate one-way lane on either side for an entrance and an exit, and I delineated those with some IMT markings and a little security checkpoint. I also used Traffic Manager to add a stop sign at the intersection so that any vehicles entering over on this side will lurch to a halt briefly at the gate to have their ID checked or whatever. For the gate itself, I used this vanilla one, which I think looks pretty good, and it always comes in handy in this kind of instance where you need an automatic sort of gate. I did add a couple of fence pieces here just as a trial run, but we're going to come back later and add a different style of fence when we fence up the entire facility later on near the end of the episode. For the final touches on this portion of the build, I thought that it would be visually interesting to add a visible pipe network running along the entire water treatment facility process. We have this little corridor here where there's a little bit of space in between the buildings and the road, so I got rid of the pedestrian access in order to clear that up completely, and then I dragged out some more of this pipe network, making sure that the nodes are set to 0 offset so that you don't have these kind of unnatural long bends. Although now that I'm thinking about it, we do have multiple pipe bending facilities in the city, so it might not be that hard for them to just order up a couple of bent pipes that have a nice shallow slope to them, but that's probably beside the point. I wanted them to feel a little bit more connected into the buildings, so I added some pavement bits where it runs next to each building. Although now that I'm kind of looking at it, I think it would probably look better to have like little offshoots or spurs running off of the pipeline into each building. But I don't know if there would actually be space to do that here, so I'm probably just going to leave it as is. As far as like doing particular builds is concerned, I don't like to repeat myself too much on this channel. I mean, I'm sure I do sometimes, but I try not to. So I didn't want to just make another water treatment facility because I've done that before. So to bring something different to the build, I looked to everyone's favorite coastal Wisconsin city, Milwaukee, where they have a pretty cool water treatment plant where they not only treat wastewater, but they also apparently somehow apply some process to the resulting sewage sludge to turn it into fertilizer that has this name that I'm not going to pronounce so that the Wisconsinites don't come at me. I have to say that this is a very cool use of resources, and it just seems like the sort of thing that they might also do in Duluth. I don't think they do, but it seems like the sort of thing that might fit in here. So we're going to build something that resembles the facility in Milwaukee. I used another building from the nuclear power plant set for the main facility, and then added this distinctive smokestack piece that you see in Milwaukee. To do this, I moved the camera down to freeway level for a moment, just so I could make sure that the size looks reasonable from down below, because I wanted this facility to look pretty bulky and impressive, but not like totally massive, like when you drive past big refineries on the freeway or whatever. I wanted it to be kind of in between that and a smaller industrial facility. Next to that, there is this smaller attached thing. There's something like this in Milwaukee that has these big pipes running in between the buildings and these kind of small stacks sticking out of it. And so to represent that, I'm just going to use a couple of these small brick buildings, which I think have kind of a nice generic industrial look. And in between them, I'm going to use this like final boss version of the pipeline network to connect that up to the main building. Next to that, I decided to use one of these natural gas balls to basically use as fuel for whatever is going on in this building. Presumably they would need some kind of combustion to do this process. I don't think it's really realistic for compressed natural gas to be used for this kind of facility. I think it's more for like fueling vehicles, I guess, apparently, or that sort of thing. But I had this asset and I thought it looked really cool in this location, so we're just going to pretend that it makes sense in this universe. I'm also going to add some industrial blocks to the main building later on to represent the actual productive capacity of the facility, but that's going to come in just a minute. First, I wanted to take care of the rail spur that I mentioned before. Here, I took the details from Milwaukee again, adding a little shelter where the loading would actually take place, and I also figured since there was some space here, I would add a truck lane in as well, coming alongside the rail spur. Attached to that, we have these silos and an elevator where the fertilizer is stored for shipment. I'm just using the same assets that I've used all throughout the port for the various grain silos and stuff, but doing the same thing with the smokestack from before and lowering the camera down and resizing it so that it just looks a little bit more modest from ground level, because this isn't going to be like a huge facility that's like pumping out tons and tons and tons of fertilizer. It's just kind of a more mid-sized one. It's a bit of an awkward spot because there's no real visible connection between the elevator and the production facility, but it's really the only spot that I had like a reasonable amount of space here for the rail spur, and I think it looks kind of cool having it along the shoreline anyway, so I guess we're just gonna have to imagine that there's some sort of underground conveyor that connects the production side to the storage side. So apparently in Milwaukee, the fertilizer is loaded into cars, rail cars, which then take a short trip over to the port, where it's loaded onto other longer distance means of transportation. So I'm going to represent that sort of function by having a couple of these hopper cars down here. I thought it would be cool to have one of these little tug things attached. I don't know what they're called. But I didn't really have anything in my collection that was purpose-built for rail, so I just made one myself using one of these little truck ones that are meant to pull trailers around the port. It probably does look a little underpowered to pull these massive full rail cars around, but hopefully it's not too distracting because I'm just going to end up covering it up anyway by extending out the shelter here so that the whole thing can be covered up by this roof. To finish off the build, we're going to focus on the perimeter, adding some road markings along the loop road, some fences, and some foliage as well, all of which I think is going to make the property look nice and distinct, and just the whole build look a little bit more complete. After that, we'll add a few more interesting details to make everything pop. For the road markings, at first I tried adding in a double yellow line, but I thought that felt a little bit too restrictive, and I think in industrial context anyway, you usually have dashed lines, so I'm just going to do a single yellow dashed line. Just ignore this totally messed up intersection here. I'm going to come back later off camera and fix that up. So about halfway through this process, I realized that, and I seem to always do this for some reason, I realized that I should have been adding fences in at the same time, and maybe even lighting, so that I could just copy and paste things a little bit more easily and not have to do multiple passes. So I added in this, I guess, nice chain link fence. But I think it looks kind of cool. It's on top of these concrete barriers. It just looks a little bit more secure, I suppose. I'm going to offset these a little bit from the road so that it doesn't look too cramped. I didn't want to push it too far over into the embankment because then I feel like you could just kind of jump off the hill to get over the fence. So if you were really motivated to contaminate the sewage supply, I suppose you could break in and do that. So obviously we want to avoid that at all costs. So I'm going to keep the fence at a reasonable distance in between the road and the embankment. I also had to manually add in some fence networks at various places because there wasn't really a corresponding length of road, which is kind of annoying, but I think it's worth it to get that complete enclosure. So moving over to the back entrance of the facility, I figured I should add some kind of secured entrance as well, kind of like over and around front. So it's meant to be a back entrance, but I ended up making it a little bit fancier than the main one because I went for this sort of split design by stretching out the node and then creating a grass filler in the middle, which kind of forces it into a one-way system, which does limit trucks from turning in a couple of directions. So it's basically, it kind of turns the whole facility into a loop almost on this end. But I think that's a pretty good sacrifice for getting a cool looking intersection, at least in my opinion. To blend everything into the surrounding environment, I'm going to add some trees. Now for those bonus details that I mentioned earlier. In Duluth, there is this kind of subdued pattern on top of the clarifier domes. I don't really know if that's just an aesthetic design element or if there's some kind of practical reason for it, but I thought that it would spice things up a little bit to add a design to our domes. Luckily, all of these were already turned into POs anyway, as I usually do with basically everything that I put down these days. So it was basically just as easy as adding in a few color rectangles to the textures and just fiddling around with them until I got a pattern that looked cool. This wasn't really even an intentional design at first. It was just something that I kind of stumbled across by kind of rotating these around and moving them around on the texture. But I think it ended up looking pretty cool. Kind of like the modern depictions of like Viking shields where you have like patterns painted onto the front. I don't know if they were historically like that at all, but anyway, that kind of just like very simple pattern with simple colors I think looks really nice. I thought that having all 4 of them be the exact same pattern looked a little bit boring and repetitive, so I mirrored 2 of them just to get a more interesting symmetry. So you almost have like an X pattern with the 4 red bars across the 4 domes and kind of a diamond pattern with the blue ones. And I think it just looks a little bit more symmetrical that way. And of course, I copied the same pattern over to the secondary clarifiers as well. I did forget to record it, but that is probably for the best because it was so mind-numbingly boring that I sort of wanted to scoop my eyeballs out with a spoon when I was done, so you didn't want to see it. With the surprise lighting pass done, there are just a couple of things that I forgot to add in earlier. First, of course, we need to have some smoke coming out of the smokestack. I used this vanilla smoke prop for that. It's animated, so you can get these nice little puffs of smoke coming out of it. And I raised it all the way up to the very top of the stack. And I think that results in a nice, cool industrial look. Finally, we need a spot for the treated water to be squirted back out into the lake. This was kind of an afterthought because I forgot to have it written down on my my little plan for this build. So I just built it by adding a structure using this dock prop and clipping in some of these tubes. I decided to only have a few of them have water flowing out using these tiny animated waterfall props, which are kind of adorable. With the idea being there that they're not always going to be operating at peak capacity, so you'd want to have the ability to increase your output if needed by having more of these be active. I also forgot to mention that the final step in the wastewater treatment process after the secondary clarifiers, I believe, is that there's chemical treatment. So basically they'll add in chlorine and other stuff, I guess, and all of this neutralizes stuff that is already present in the water. And that's going to be done right before it's shot out of these back into the lake. So that process would probably take place in one of the two buildings, or maybe the additional outbuilding that I added earlier, or it would just be underground. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Amaranth Bay. Next time, we're going to be putting the finishing touches on the port area, and after that, we're going to move on to something else. I want to say thank you to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellen. And of course, thank you for watching. I'm really proud of myself that I went this whole episode without saying the word shit.